to continue actually with your own expertise here on the question of memory and remembering, and what we can remember and what we don't remember, and what we wish to and what we're unable perhaps to remember. And I'm thinking about something in the newspapers and on the radio programs, which have been hugely moving over the course of the week. The question of blame, who's accountable, has come up time and again. Families, clergy, politicians, arms, who is responsible? And what strikes me, of course, is that it took a report like this about the system of abuse, in which vast numbers of people have been implicit. It took somebody like Catherine Corless, apparently, to remind us of what we had already known. I mean, how can this be? I mean, is this social forgetting? Is this what another Burns scholar, Guy Biner, calls disremembering? How does this happen?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to come up with a pithy explanation, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
I think that to deal with the first part of the question about a question of blame, it would be very nice if there were a single group in society or institution that we could ascribe blame to. It is clearly a network of responsibility. And it is also then, as a result, a network of knowledge and awareness. And the way that, and I think of it sometimes as a kind of subterranean awareness. And it's strange because what it also makes me wonder is, what will we look back on in 10 or 20 years and say, and our children will say to us, I don't have children, but children will say to us, how could you ignore that? I mean, you know, I'm living in Ireland today, and we have however many direct provision centres where asylum seekers are living in massively overcrowded and, I mean, situations which totally violate their human rights, where they are getting COVID-19 at much higher levels than the rest of the population. And we're debating, how could society have looked away from the mother and baby homes? We're always looking away from something.
Your term subterranean awareness is a very moving one, a very powerful one there.
Yeah, and so, you know, I think it does behove us to ask those questions of ourselves, and as a result, then not really sit in judgment. Sometimes it feels too big. In terms of a subject, I'm really struck by, and I know the Ryan report far better than I know the other reports. I'm really struck by, there was a story told by one of the witnesses to the Ryan Commission, which was between 2000 and 2009. And he said that he was sent to the local shop to buy more canes because the priests, you know, obviously used them for corporal punishment. And the shopkeeper broke all of the canes and said, go back and tell them that I didn't have any. And I mean, that actually gives me chills. Those tiny actions tell you about that subterranean awareness and about the tiny actions of compassion that people are capable of making, and the difference they're capable of making. And I mean, I talked to one woman, and she's in her 60s now, late 60s now, and she remembers being given a sweet once a week by a nurse who came to the school on weekends. And when she was a child. So you're talking about 60 years later, she remembers tiny moments like that. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which small actions actually can make a difference, just as we shouldn't either allow ourselves to forget in the current moment what big institutional things are. I mean, I also think we place a lot of trust in governments to act on our behalf, whether we're talking about institutions, we're talking about climate crisis, we're talking about how our past is preserved and protected.
And perhaps we put a lot of trust in government, but I think we were always skeptical of government in this country. We did, however, put a huge amount of trust in the churches.
Yes.
And I think, I don't know, Mike, do you want to take from there?
No, it's just, I mean, one thing I think just leading on from that, I mean, there is that sense, I mean, even in the years I've been living here, but I mean, sort of going back into the 90s and the 80s, with these big reports, we've been there before.
Mm.
You walk around any town, any city, pretty much anybody who's lived there their life can tell you what went on, not what went on, but what those buildings were, what they symbolized, why they had high walls. But there is this whole culture of I don't want to say Irish population kind of willingly knowing, but definitely knowing. And I think what I'm intrigued in by is your idea of the way the people who went through these experiences have to be believed first off, and that's non-negotiable. And yet we just seem to be going through these reports that constantly, again, not criticizing the researchers, but in the way they're presented, perhaps, the tone of them, the fact they're channeled through government, the fact that, it's the church, but they're over there somewhere. The fact that we're just going through this time and time again, we just keep repeating this. And it's almost as if, as a state, this country, and this is a diaspora problem, obviously adoption has gone global, it's just the same news every time. I mean, there's something fundamentally depressing about that there's given, I mean, you and I have worked on this before in the seminars and stuff, the whole idea of justice and how it's applied around the world and how people have thought of new models and new conversations. The Irish just seem to say, well, commission, job done, tick, move on.
I mean, I don't think it's our problem alone, Mike. We just happen to live in this country and know it better than others.
Mm.
I mean, I think that, you're looking at other states. I mean, Canada has had exactly the same issue with their reports and their commissions. There are signs of hope in the sense that when the Ryan report was launched in 2009, survivors were not allowed to come to the launch. It was only for the media, and so they were in a room outside the launch. I mean, it's kind of extraordinary. Whereas on this occasion, survivors were given the report a day in advance. I mean, a day isn't enough, but they were given a day in advance. I think that the former Minister for Children, Catherine Zappone, set up a forum for survivors to have a voice and to think about issues of transitional justice and reconciliation. And so that there was some sense of stakeholders' involvement. And that's really crucial. I think to come back to the church and what you said at the end, Joe, there is like, it's the failure of responsibility from the church is extraordinary, and the consistency with which the church is allowed to get off the hook time and time again, whether you're talking about financially in terms of redress. So they have held on to the money that was meant to go to survivors in extraordinary situations where survivors are literally dying, they're literally in hospital, and are asking for their funerals to be paid for. That's the extent to which the church has withheld compensation. Or to the extent that they refuse to apologize fully. They refuse to, and as you and I both know, Mike, they refuse to actually release their records. They have a lot of records that we're not seeing, that they have concealed or destroyed. And they're doing that worldwide. This is not only restricted to Ireland. And no one has gone to jail. Not a single person. And this is a real problem. It's interesting to me. I mean, if you expand it out to other kinds of truth commissions, and again, very broad brushstrokes here, I'm struck by the fact that in Argentina, for example, they never had a truth commission. Instead, they had court cases. They had an amnesty, and then they overturned that amnesty with a case to the Argentinian Supreme Court. And instead, people have gone to jail. And there is a choice between the kinds of truths that commissions can make possible and which are important in terms of acknowledgement and healing, but that actually nobody is punished.
But one of the big questions, I'm going to try and lead into notes to self here, but pick up on a comment you talked about earlier of going to UCD back in the day when the faculty were mainly men who went up to the bar and put the world right in their own image. going back into the church, a male church, isn't actually one of the big problems here, patriarchy, historically, presently, and that how we dance around the specifics of the issue that's going to get thrown up, that is a huge problem in Irish society, ongoing. It's ongoing in the professions, it's ongoing in the universities, in the church, in government, etc., ad nauseum.
Yes, it is. And the patriarchy is why there's Trump. I mean, you know, it is poison. And it is consistently problematic and really, really virulent, to use a virus metaphor, and really, really difficult to get rid of as a result. And if we could go into lockdown on the patriarchy, that would be great. And sorry, I'm kind of joking about it because I have lots of serious answers. We would be here for a really long time. It is very obviously the problem.
Please.
And it requires everyone to be at the table in order to fix it. And this is the problem with any kind of negotiation, which is that if we want equality, then some people have to give up power so that others can have it. Sharing is not possible with everybody sitting at the same table and not wanting to give up their chairs. And then it becomes rhetorical, and you hear phrases like "we would really like to." And I mean, you know, just even to bring it back to the university, in UCD, they brought in a quota system for a certain level of committees, so that committees had to have 40% have women representatives on them. And then they had to bring in another rule that said that women could only sit on a certain number of committees because there were so few women that they were sitting on all of the bloody committees, and they were massively overworked as a result, which is part of the problem of changing the system, is who's going to do the work. And women and other minorities end up being the workhorses time and time again. So that is why I do the jokey version at the beginning, because I would really like men to fix some of this problem.
I know that along with Mike, we'd all very much like to turn to your own writing and notes to self. But there are a number of questions coming in, and they're all terribly welcome, actually. So continue, please, to pull up your questions here, because we've still got plenty of time, and we'll address as many of them as we possibly can. And first of all, thanks very much. Nice to see you out there, Tim McMahon, for your kind comments, and also Jim Dalsmer. Thank you so much. Elizabeth, we're going to come to your question in a few moments, actually, and David Gillette. But one on the topic we're on, I hear from Marcus Breen, and Marcus says that the implications of the Mother and Baby Homes report this week. He says, he wonders, how do you see the emergence of secularism in Ireland as the dominant role of the Catholic Church fades? And secondly, he wonders, could you imagine Ireland ever returning to a culture more influenced by its ancient traditions of law and culture? So he's asking you to look back and to look forward a little bit there.
That's a very interesting, the second half is very, very interesting. And the first is that I think a lot of people are still Catholics, even if the church has been, whatever it has been, undermined. It's had its authority massively undermined. And I think we need to make a distinction between the institution and the faith. And the religion, and I'm not an expert on either, but I think at our peril we talk about people's faith as if it were the institution, because that is a very private and deeply personal thing. But I welcome secularism in terms of state institutions. I find it extraordinary that 92% of primary school education is still in effect run by the Catholic Church in Ireland. And I think the influence of that has lessened massively. But, you know, my nephew goes to school in a room with a Virgin Mary at the top, and is consistently told that God made the world. And you know, whereas when he comes home, he gets a very rational, scientific view of how the world was made. And he's like, but you know, my teacher said. And so I think there still is very much a conflict between the ways in which religion basically is still a very much a too strong or too prevalent part of Irish institutions.